The rain didn't knock on the diner windows that night. It attacked them, hard, loud, endless. Like the city itself was angry at everyone still awake. Naomi Brooks stood behind the counter with aching feet and heavy eyes. It was past midnight, the kind of hour when hope feels thinner than steam rising from old coffee. She had already worked 14 hours. Her hands smelled of grease and soap, her back burned, and her thoughts were stuck on one thing: her daughter. Medicine was running low. Rent was due. The bus ride home would cost nearly everything she had earned. That was when the door opened. Cold air rushed inside, along with a man who did not belong anywhere. Wet clothes, bent shoulders, shoes held together by will, not stitching. Most people looked away. Some rolled their eyes. The manager sighed loudly. Not again. The man walked slowly, every step careful, like pain lived inside his bones. He sat alone in the far booth near the heater, his hands shaking as he wrapped them around an empty mug. The manager moved fast. "You can't stay here. No money, no service." The man nodded, not angry, not begging, just tired. Naomi watched from behind the counter. Something about him felt different. Not the clothes, not the smell. The eyes, they were sharp, watching, hurting. Before she could think, before fear or logic caught up, Naomi spoke. "He can sit. I'll cover it." The manager stared. "You serious, Naomi?" She nodded, already grabbing a bowl. Soup and bread. Nothing fancy, but warm. She set it down gently. The man looked up, shocked, as if kindness had surprised him. "Eat," she said softly. "You look frozen," he whispered. "Thank you." His voice cracked. He ate slowly, like each bite mattered, like he hadn't tasted food in days. When he finished, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a single, crumpled bill. $5. He placed it on the table, pushed it toward her. For a moment, Naomi froze. $5 meant a lot. It meant bus fare. It meant medicine. It meant breathing room. Her fingers touched the bill. Then, she pushed it back. "I can't take that. Guests don't pay for kindness." The diner went quiet. Even the rain felt softer. The man stared at her, really stared, like something inside him had cracked open. He nodded slowly, stood up, and left the bill on the table anyway. Naomi picked it up, walked after him, and pressed it back into his hand. "Please," she said, "you need it more than me." The man hesitated, then closed his fingers around it. "Thank you," he said, "not just for the food." Then he left. Naomi returned to her counter, heart racing, hands shaking. She didn't know that the man she had just fed was named Henry Calloway. She didn't know he owned more buildings than she had ever seen. She didn't know he was dying. Henry Calloway stepped back into the rain, the $5 bill still warm in his palm. For decades, he had been feared, obeyed, surrounded by luxury. Yet he had never felt smaller or more awake. 1 week earlier, a doctor had spoken quietly. Stage 4. Months, not years. When Henry told his children, they didn't cry. Marcus asked about shares. Alina asked about trusts. No one asked how he felt. That night, Henry couldn't sleep. He saw their faces calculating, waiting. Something broke inside him. He wanted to know something before he died. Was kindness still real, or was everything built on greed? So he stripped away his name, his power, his money. He dressed like nothing, became invisible, and the world showed him its truth. Hotels rejected him. Restaurants pushed him out. Security shoved him into the rain. Then came the diner. Then came Naomi, a woman with nothing, who gave without asking, who lost $5 she desperately needed just to protect a stranger's dignity. Standing in the alley where his driver waited, Henry straightened his spine. The test was over. He had not found goodness in boardrooms. He had not found it in blood. He found it under flickering lights, in a tired waitress with a quiet voice. And in that moment, with only $5 between them, the future of a billion-dollar empire changed direction. But Naomi didn't know that yet, and neither did the people who would soon do anything to stop it. Because, when kindness threatens power, power always fights back. And what Henry Calloway decided next would tear his family apart and drag Naomi into a world she never asked to enter. Henry had made his choice. But his children were about to realize everything they thought they owned was slipping away, and they would not let that happen quietly. Henry Calloway didn't go home right away. The rain traced lines on the car windows, blurring the empty city streets into streaks of color. For the first time in what felt like a lifetime, his mind wasn't on profit margins or corporate takeovers. He was thinking about a waitress, and a $5 bill she wouldn't take. Back in his penthouse, the silence was deafening, louder than any boardroom argument. The marble floors were cold underfoot, and the floor-to-ceiling windows showed a city he owned but no longer recognized. There was nothing warm here, nothing real. He sat alone in the vast, empty space, and replayed the scene at the diner over and over. Naomi, she hadn't hesitated. She hadn't asked a single question, or looked around to see who was watching. It wasn't a performance of kindness designed for attention or a reward. She acted simply because it was the right thing to do. That simple, uncalculated decency haunted him. It stood in stark contrast to his own children. His children, Marcus and Alina, had been given everything. the best education money could buy, access to circles of immense power, a life of privilege. Yet, when faced with the reality of his mortality, their own father's impending death, all they could see were numbers on a balance sheet. They saw an inheritance, not a person. A sudden, sharp cough racked Henry's body, and a familiar pain burned in his chest. A grim reminder. Time was a resource he was quickly running out of. Before the first light of dawn broke over the city, he made a phone call. His attorney arrived shortly after, his expression a familiar mix of caution and loyalty. In all their years together, the man had seen Henry make ruthless, brilliant moves, but he was rarely surprised. Until now, Henry spoke slowly, his voice weak but his words crystal clear, each one filled with absolute certainty. I want to change everything. The attorney paused, the pen hovering over his notepad. Henry, he said softly, you understand this will cause a war. A small, grim smile touched Henry's lips. Let it. They talked for hours. They went over trusts, built legal protections, and created sealed, anonymous beneficiaries. Henry was many things, but foolish was not one of them. He knew Marcus and Alina would fight this. They fought over everything, especially when money was involved. This would be the battle of their lives. So he planned with meticulous care. No names would be mentioned. No leaks would be tolerated. No hints would be given. The true nature of his inheritance would remain a complete secret until the very end. He would let them believe they had already won. When the first set of papers was drafted, Henry paused, holding the pen. He wasn't afraid. For the first time in decades he felt a profound sense of relief. He was finally choosing meaning over bloodline. Meanwhile, on the other side of the city, Naomi Brooks was wiping down the last of the diner tables. A strange feeling lingered from the night before, like a faint echo of the encounter with the old man. But life didn't wait for strange feelings to pass. Her daughter needed breakfast. School forms were sitting on the counter, waiting to be signed. A stack of bills waited patiently on the small kitchen table. She never mentioned the man to anyone. To her, it wasn't a story to tell. It was just what decent people did for each other. When Henry returned to the penthouse later that day, he walked into a storm. Marcus stood by the window, phone clutched in his hand, his jaw tight with fury. What is this I'm hearing? He demanded, his voice sharp. People are calling me, saying you're acting strange. Running around the city dressed like a beggar. Henry calmly removed his coat, placing it carefully on a chair. Because I wanted to see who people really are, he replied, his voice even. Alina, standing by the bar, let out a short, humorless laugh. This is embarrassing. Father, the board is concerned. Concerned? Henry asked, turning to face them both. Are they concerned about my health, or my money? The silence that followed was his answer. It was all the answer he needed. In the days that followed, the pressure mounted. His most trusted advisors suddenly suggested he undergo psychological evaluations. Whispers about his mental clarity started circulating. Doctors who had treated him for years were questioned. Henry saw the strategy for what it was, clear as day. If they couldn't control him, they would discredit him. They would paint him as an old man who had lost his mind. One evening, Marcus finally snapped. You are destroying everything we built, he yelled, his face red with rage. Henry looked at his son, his gaze steady and unwavering. No, Marcus, I built it. You only waited for it. The words landed like stones in the silent room. Marcus stared, speechless for a moment, before storming out, slamming the door behind him. Alina tried a different tactic. She approached with tears in her eyes, her voice soft and pleading. Daddy, please, you're not thinking clearly. Let us help you. Henry slowly shook his head. Help is what I needed a long time ago, he said, his voice laced with a sadness that cut deeper than any anger. And you were never there. That night, Henry sealed the final documents. There was no going back. Across town, Naomi tucked her young daughter into bed, whispering a bedtime story. Later, as she counted the day's tips, she noticed her cash was off. $5 short. She thought for a moment, then a small smile touched her lips. Some things, she knew, were worth more than money. Dignity mattered more. Henry sat alone in his vast study, looking out at the glittering city lights, the empire he had once ruled. He wasn't angry anymore. A profound sense of calm had settled over him. His little test had revealed everything he needed to know, and the world was about to learn a powerful lesson. That power, given to the wrong hands, only destroys, but power given to the right heart can heal. What Henry Calloway did next would shock everyone. His board of directors, his lifelong attorney, his own children, and most of all, it would shock the one woman who never wanted anything from him. Marcus and Alina believed the greatest fortune in the city was already theirs. They were about to discover a truth that would not only shatter their expectations but turn them into bitter enemies, putting an innocent waitress directly in their line of fire. The first sign came quietly. Too quietly. Henry Calloway noticed it first in the way his grand old house felt different. It was a subtle shift in the atmosphere, a change in the air itself. Phone calls to his children, Marcus and Alina, suddenly went unanswered. Important meetings he was supposed to lead were mysteriously canceled without his approval. A profound silence began to settle in the spaces where their eager obedience once lived. It was the silence of a coming storm, and Henry, a man who had navigated countless tempests in the world of business, felt the pressure drop. Marcus was the first to drop the facade. The thin veneer of respect he had always shown his father began to crack and peel away. His voice, once deferential, turned sharp and impatient. Every conversation, no matter how it started, seemed to end with him demanding numbers, figures, and asset reports. He spoke of the estate not as a family legacy, but as a prize to be claimed, a resource to be divided. Alina, on the other hand, took a different approach. She became careful, terribly, dangerously polite. Her smiles didn't reach her eyes, and her words were coated in a saccharine sweetness that felt more like a threat than affection. They were moving in concert, a pincer movement designed to isolate and control him. Henry saw it all with a clarity that would have surprised them. They weren't worried about his health, not really. They were worried about time. They were worried that the vast fortune he had built would slip through their fingers. He could almost hear the whispers when he wasn't in the room, the frantic planning, the greedy calculations. Moves were already being made, legal and financial chess pieces being positioned on a board he was no longer allowed to see. He started noticing the language of the lawyers on his payroll changing. They spoke in careful, ambiguous phrases, littered with clauses about contingencies and future planning. His most trusted financial advisors began suggesting new layers of protection for his assets, protections that seemed designed to limit his own access. Then, one day, one of them, a man he'd known for 20 years, casually mentioned the possibility of a psychiatric review. Just a formality. Of course, to ensure everything was in order, Henry almost smiled. It was so predictable, so utterly cliché. They were falling into the exact trap he had anticipated, following the oldest playbook in the world. Declare the king mad so you can seize the throne. The confrontation he knew was coming arrived on a quiet afternoon. Alina sat across from him in the sun-drenched library, her hands folded neatly in her lap, her smile as tight as a drum. "People are talking, father," she said, her voice a soft, concerned murmur. "They're saying, well, they think you're not well." Henry leaned back in his leather chair, the old wood groaning under his weight. He steepled his fingers and looked at her, truly looked at her, searching for any flicker of the daughter he remembered. "And what do you think, Alina?" he asked slowly. She hesitated. It was just for a second, a brief, almost imperceptible pause, but it was long enough. "I think," she finally said, her voice losing its feigned warmth, "that you're confused." That one word, confused. It was the key. It told him everything he needed to know. It was the justification they would use for everything that was to come. From that moment on, Henry Calloway went silent. He stopped sharing his thoughts, his plans, his feelings. He became a fortress. He spoke only to his personal attorney, a man he trusted implicitly, and only in rooms that were swept for listening devices, behind doors that were sealed and secured. His children wanted to believe he was losing his mind. Fine, he would let them believe it, while he moved with a mind sharper than ever. He hired private investigators. Not to protect himself, but to watch his children. To prepare for the inevitable attack he knew was coming. His attorney had warned him they would try to find something, anything, to discredit him. And Henry knew exactly what they would look for. A scandal, a weakness. He could almost write their script for them. It would involve a woman. Of course, it would. A young, vulnerable woman. A waitress, perhaps, in a quiet diner. A story of a lonely old man being manipulated. They wouldn't even need to know her name yet. They would invent her if they had to. And across the city, that woman existed. Her name was Naomi Brooks. She lived a life utterly removed from Henry's world of sealed doors and corporate espionage. Her days were a whirlwind of waking before dawn, rushing her daughter to school, and then heading to the diner for a long shift of serving coffee and counting tips. She was too busy trying to make rent to notice the seismic shifts happening in a mansion on the other side of town. But lately, she had started noticing strange things. A dark sedan parked across the street from her apartment, the same man sitting in it for hours at a time. A customer at the diner asking questions that felt a little too personal, a little too specific, about her schedule and her life outside of work. She brushed it off. Life was already heavy enough with real worries. She didn't have time for imaginary ones. One night, Henry received a detailed report from his investigators. "They're digging," his attorney said, his voice grim over the secure line. "They're trying to find a connection, some impropriety. They think there's a woman." Henry closed his eyes, a weary sigh escaping his lips. "Of course they do," he murmured. "They always believed money must follow manipulation. They can't imagine kindness without a motive." His children saw the world through a lens of pure transaction. Every action had a price, every relationship a hidden ledger. "Let them dig," Henry said, his voice hardening. "They will find nothing." Because there was nothing to find. Naomi's life was an open book, filled with hard work and love for her daughter. She had nothing to hide. Still, a cold knot of worry tightened in Henry's chest. He wasn't worried for himself. He was worried for her. for the collateral damage his children were willing to inflict in their quest for his fortune. That was when he decided to strengthen the walls around himself even further. More safeguards, more layers of distance, more impenetrable silence. Naomi would not know what was happening. Not yet, because knowing would make her a target, and he would not allow that. He had to protect her innocence in this ugly war. The inevitable explosion came from Marcus. He burst into Henry's study one evening, his face flushed with anger. "I know there's someone," he snapped, bypassing any pretense of conversation. "A woman, I know you're favoring her in the will." Henry didn't even blink. He simply looked up from his book. "And if there is?" he asked, his calm a stark contrast to his son's fury. The quiet question sent Marcus over the edge. He slammed his hand down on the polished mahogany desk. "You're being played. Can't you see it? She's playing you for a fool." Slowly, painfully, Henry stood up. The ache in his joints was a constant, nagging reminder of his own mortality. He faced his son, a man he barely recognized, his eyes filled not with anger, but with a profound sadness. "No, Marcus," he said, his voice clear and steady. "For the first time in my life, I am not being played." Those few words, spoken with absolute certainty, hung in the air, ending the conversation more effectively than any shout ever could. From that day forward, the house ceased to feel like a home. It felt like a battlefield. The air was thick with tension, every hallway a potential ambush, every meal a silent truce. Henry knew his time was running out. His body reminded him daily, a failing machine that could give out at any moment. But his resolve, his determination to do one last right thing, never wavered. Across the city, Naomi Brooks tucked her daughter into bed, reading her a story. As she held her close, a strange feeling she couldn't quite explain pressed down on her chest. A sense of unease, a premonition that something was coming. She just didn't know what. And somewhere in the vast space between the greed of Marcus and Elena and the quiet kindness of Henry, a line had been crossed. A moral boundary had been breached, one that could never be uncrossed. The frantic search for dirt on a non-existent scandal was destined to fail, and when it did, when they found nothing but the truth, Marcus and Elena would be forced to make a far more dangerous, and far more desperate, choice. The quiet war was about to turn loud. The search produced nothing. No scandals, no secrets, no weakness. It was baffling. Fear started to replace confidence in Marcus. He just couldn't understand it. There had to be something. Everyone had something. A skeleton in the closet, a past mistake. But Naomi Brooks, she didn't. Her life was simple, transparent, and honest. And that, in their world, made her incredibly dangerous. Elena, ever the strategist, changed tactics. If they couldn't destroy the person, they would destroy the story. The rumors began quietly, like a slow poison seeping into the cracks of society. A waitress, influencing a sick, old man. Whispers of manipulation, undue pressure, and gold digging. None of it had proof, of course, but proof was never the goal. The goal was doubt. And doubt was a powerful weapon. Henry watched all of this unfold from a distance. Every whispered lie, every sideways glance his children orchestrated, only confirmed his decision. He turned to his attorney, a grim satisfaction in his voice. "You see," he said, "this is who they really are." The masks were off. Their true nature, greedy and ruthless, was on full display for him to witness. He had given them every advantage in life, but he had failed to give them character. It was a bitter pill to swallow. The tension finally boiled over one night. Marcus, his face a mask of fury, burst into Henry's study. His voice, usually so calm and controlled, shook with rage. "End this," he shouted, his fist slamming down on the mahogany desk. "Fix the will, now." Henry looked at his son, this man he had raised, and felt an overwhelming wave of sadness wash over him. There was no love in his eyes, only desperation. "You're not afraid of losing me," Henry said, his voice quiet but firm. "You're afraid of losing money." Marcus froze. The words hit him like a physical blow because they were the absolute, undeniable truth, a truth he could never admit, not even to himself. The silence that followed was heavy, broken only by Henry's call to security. As his own son was escorted from the house, Henry knew, with a chilling certainty, that any hope for reconciliation was gone forever. The bridge had been burned. Across the city, Naomi felt the pressure building around her like a physical force. The atmosphere at the diner had shifted. Customers stared a little too long. Their whispers followed her as she cleared tables. One day, a regular customer, a woman she'd known for years, asked her point-blank if she knew a Henry Calloway. The name meant nothing to her. "No," she replied honestly, a confused frown on her face. It was the simple truth. But in the web of lies being spun, her truth sounded like a denial. That night, a sleek black car followed her home. The headlights were like two predatory eyes in her rearview mirror. Her heart began to pound in her chest. She quickened her pace, clutching her keys tightly in her hand. The sound of her own footsteps echoed in the quiet street. Once inside, she locked and bolted the door, leaning against it, trying to catch her breath. She went to her daughter's room, watching her sleep peacefully, and held her close. a fierce protective instinct surging through her. Who were these people? What did they want from her? Meanwhile, in his quiet study, Henry picked up his pen. His hand, though weakened by his illness, was steady. With a final, decisive stroke, he signed the documents and pressed the seal into the warm wax. A sense of finality settled over him. "This ends tonight," he whispered into the stillness of the room. The pain in his body was a constant companion, but his mind was clear. He didn't sleep that night. He didn't need to. The path ahead was illuminated, and there was no turning back, no room for second thoughts. Henry Calloway was running out of time. His life was drawing to a close, but his final act was just beginning. His children, so consumed by their own greed and entitlement, were about to learn a lesson they would never forget. A lesson written, not in dollars and cents, but in consequences. They were about to discover that control without character, that power without principle, ultimately leads to ruin. The storm was coming, and they had no idea they were standing right in its path. And at the center of it all was a woman who just wanted to live a simple, honest life. A woman named Naomi Brooks. Her life, and theirs, was about to change forever. The city was quiet in the early hours, but it wasn't a peaceful quiet, it was a waiting quiet. In his sprawling penthouse study, Henry Calloway sat alone. The silence punctuated only by the soft rustle of legal folders spread across his mahogany desk. His breathing was slow, but there was an uneven tremor to it, a ghost of the battle raging within his own body. Every signature he would make tonight mattered. This wasn't about revenge, not really. He told himself it was about correction. A lifetime of rewarding ambition, even when it was devoid of empathy. For years he had mistaken brutal efficiency for strength, ruthlessness for resolve, and now, at the end of it all, he finally understood the true cost of that mistake. The soft chime of the private elevator announced his attorney's arrival just after midnight. There was no small talk, no polite hesitation. The air was thick with purpose. "We need to finalize everything," Henry said, his voice a low rumble that still carried the weight of command. Before my body decides for me, they dove into the documents. A labyrinth of legal jargon and financial architecture. They reviewed every line, every clause, every fail-safe. Trust structures were examined, firewalls fortified, and protections layered so deep they were practically subterranean. No loopholes, no leverage, no access for those who expected everything. The ultimate beneficiary remained unnamed, a ghost in the machine. Their identity a secret so absolute it was known only to Henry and the man sitting across from him. If anyone challenges this, the attorney stated, more a fact than a question, they will fail. Henry picked up the pen. His hand, once so steady, trembled slightly. He paused, took a breath, and then signed. And then again on the next page. With each deliberate stroke of ink, he felt a weight lifting, a burden he'd carried for decades, slowly dissolving. Across town, in a small, brightly lit kitchen, Naomi Brooks sat at her table. A scattered collection of bills formed a grim mosaic in front of her. She was $5 short. Again, she stared at the empty space where the bill should have been. The gap between making it and not. Then, a soft smile touched her lips. Some things, she knew, were worth more than money. In the next room, her daughter slept peacefully, her small chest rising and falling in a gentle rhythm. And for Naomi, that sight, that simple fact, was more than enough. It was everything. Back at the penthouse, the final folder was closed with a soft, definitive thud. "It's done," Henry said quietly, the words hanging in the still air. His attorney hesitated, a rare flicker of emotion crossing his professional demeanor. "They will hate you for this," he warned. Henry simply nodded, a weary acceptance in his eyes. "They already do." That night, as the city slept, his son Marcus sent a barrage of messages. They were filled with threats, with warnings, with a desperate, clawing anger. Henry saw them, read them, and did not reply. The future, he had decided, no longer belonged to fear. It no longer belonged to them. By the time the first rays of morning light broke over the skyline, everything was sealed. The ink was dry, the transfers initiated, the legal fortifications complete. The world just didn't know it yet. Henry Calloway, the titan of industry, had made his final move. But in their own towers of glass and steel, his children were just beginning to realize the game had changed. They were about to launch their last, and most desperate, attack. The storm was coming, and this time, there would be no shelter. What would happen when they discovered the truth? That their father's empire, the one they believed was their birthright, had been given to a complete stranger. Their fury would be legendary, their methods ruthless. They wouldn't just fight it in court. They would hunt for the unnamed heir. They would try to tear down everything their father had just built. Think about it. Naomi, a single mother struggling to make ends meet, is about to become one of the wealthiest people in the country, and she has no idea. She has no idea she's the target of a family with unlimited resources and zero morality. How does she protect herself? How does she protect her daughter when the Calloway siblings come for what they believe is theirs? This isn't just about money anymore, it's about survival. Henry created this new reality, but he won't be there to see it through. He left behind a puzzle, a fortress, and a ticking time bomb. The attorney knows the legal side, but he's not a bodyguard. He can't protect Naomi from the shadows. And Marcus, along with his sister, they live in those shadows. They will use blackmail, intimidation, anything to get what they want. They'll dig into Naomi's past, looking for any weakness, any leverage they can exploit. And what about Naomi? When a lawyer shows up at her door and tells her she's inherited a fortune, what will she do? Will she even believe it? Her life of scraping by is about to be turned upside down. Suddenly, she'll have the power to change not just her own life, but the lives of so many others. But with that power comes immense danger. The Callaways see this as the ultimate betrayal, and they will stop at nothing to undo it. They will view her not as a person, but as an obstacle to be removed. The battle lines have been drawn. On one side, a mother and daughter who represent everything the Callaways despise: humility, kindness, and a life outside their gilded cage. On the other, a dynasty of predators, wounded and furious, ready to burn the world down to reclaim their prize. Henry may have corrected his legacy, but he also ignited a war, and the first shots are about to be fired. Who do you think will win? Marcus didn't sleep that night. Neither did Alina. They both felt it, a deep, unsettling shift in the air, like the pressure dropping before a storm. Something permanent had just happened. By morning, their worst fears began to crystallize. Their calls to the company, to their father's inner circle, went unanswered. Lawyers, who once offered advice with fawning smiles, suddenly became careful, their words measured and vague. Advisors, men and women who had known them since they were children, now avoided eye contact, shuffling papers and looking anywhere but at them. That was when the cold grip of panic finally set in. Marcus, never one for patience, stormed into a private meeting with the board of directors. His voice, usually so commanding, was loud but brittle. His hands were shaking, a detail he tried to hide by slamming them on the polished mahogany table. "Our father is not well," he claimed, his voice echoing in the silent, opulent room. "Decisions are being made without any oversight, without family consent." The room listened. The faces of the board members were masks of polite concern, but no one moved. No one offered support. Because they knew what Marcus and Alina were just discovering. Henry Callaway had already moved first. He had quietly activated a web of legal protections, rerouted authority through impenetrable trusts, and systematically limited their access. The power they had taken for granted their entire lives was slipping through their fingers like sand. Alina, ever the strategist, tried a different approach. She chose charm, tears, and a carefully crafted narrative of public concern. She met with journalists, her voice trembling with practiced emotion, and planted the story. A dying billionaire manipulated by a waitress. The headline was sensational, designed to ignite public outrage. It spread quickly through online tabloids and gossip columns, but it lacked fire. There was no concrete evidence, no scandalous photos, no verified inside source. It was just an accusation, a desperate cry from two children who were losing their inheritance. From his quiet study, propped up by pillows, Henry watched the drama unfold on a large screen. His cough was getting worse, a rattling sound that seemed to shake his frail frame. But his eyes were calm, his mind clear. He listened to his children's public accusations, and simply said to his nurse, "Let them speak. Noise is all they have left." He knew this battle wasn't being fought in the media. It was being fought with ink, signatures, and legal clauses he had put in place years ago. Meanwhile, in a different part of the city, Naomi felt her world begin to tilt on its axis. A reporter, smelling a story, showed up at the diner during her lunch rush. He was persistent, asking questions, saying that one name over and over again: Henry Callaway. She just shook her head, wiping down the counter, her hand steady despite the tremor she felt inside. "I don't know him," she said, and at that point, it was still mostly true. She knew the kind, elderly man who came in for coffee, not the billionaire titan of industry. But fear, a cold and unfamiliar sensation, began to creep in. This was bigger than her. This was dangerous. Still, she kept working, kept smiling at her regulars, and kept caring for the old man who seemed to need a friend. Henry knew his time was close. His body, once a source of immense power, was failing him faster than even the doctors predicted. He asked for one final meeting with his children. Marcus and Alina arrived at the mansion, their faces a mixture of anger and confidence. They were still certain they could force his hand, could break his resolve and regain control of their destiny. They walked into his room, ready for a fight. But Henry spoke first, his voice weak but clear, each word carefully chosen. "I tested the world," he said, looking from his son to his daughter. "I gave you every advantage, every opportunity, and you failed the test." Marcus let out a bitter, disbelieving laugh. "Failed? You're the one destroying your own blood, your own legacy, for a nobody." Henry's gaze didn't waver. He met his son's furious eyes. "No," he replied, his voice firm. "I'm correcting my mistake." That was the last conversation they ever had. Within days, Henry Callaway passed away. It was a quiet end, with no cameras, no public spectacle, just a profound silence that fell over the estate. And in a lawyer's vault, a set of sealed instructions waited, a final move from a master strategist. Death did not end the conflict. It was only the beginning. It was the spark that would ignite the firestorm. And the truth, hidden within the pages of Henry Calloway's last will and testament, was about to explode, changing everything, for everyone, forever. What secrets did Henry take to his grave? And what final, shocking revelation did he leave behind? The real story was just about to begin. The reading of the will wasn't a farewell. It was a verdict. Henry Calloway had chosen the setting himself, his private library. The walls were lined with books no one in his family had ever bothered to open, their leather spines standing like silent, judging soldiers. The air was thick with the scent of old paper and disappointment. Marcus Calloway arrived first, his jaw clenched so tight a muscle pulsed in his cheek. He exuded a forced confidence, the kind worn by a man who believes the world owes him everything and has always been proven right. He paced the plush oriental rug, his expensive shoes sinking into the threads, leaving temporary ghosts of his impatience. Alina followed soon after, the sharp, angry clicks of her heels on the polished hardwood floor, announcing her arrival long before she appeared in the doorway. She was already furious, her face a mask of contempt for the entire proceeding. They weren't there to grieve, they were there to collect. Their father's death was not a tragedy. It was a transaction, the final closing on a lifelong investment of tolerance for the old man. They exchanged a brief, knowing glance. Unity in a waitress. The shared belief that their inheritance was a birthright, a foregone conclusion. The attorney, Mr. Abernathy, entered last. He was a small, precise man, carrying a worn leather briefcase that seemed to hold the weight of the world, or at least, the weight of the Calloway fortune. He placed several folders on the mahogany desk, his face utterly unreadable, a practiced neutrality that had served him well for decades. He adjusted his glasses, cleared his throat, and the sound echoed in the tense silence. "We will begin," he said, his voice as dry as the pages he was about to read. The opening lines were routine, a dull drone of legal jargon. Abernathy read through a list of minor bequests, a vintage watch to a distant cousin, a small donation to a local charity, the distribution of personal items no one really wanted. Marcus visibly relaxed, a slight smirk playing on his lips. This was all going as expected, just a bit of tedious preamble before the main event, the transfer of power, the confirmation of his destiny as the new king of the Calloway Empire. He leaned back in his chair, already picturing his name on the company letterhead. Then, the tone shifted. Abernathy paused, took a sip of water, and looked directly at Marcus for the first time. "To my son, Marcus," he read, his voice now holding a new, sharper edge. "To the boy who saw my life's work as nothing more than a bank account to be drained, who mistook my patience for weakness. I leave you no controlling interest in Calloway Industries, no seat on the board, no authority over any company operations, and no cash assets." Marcus let out a single, sharp laugh. It was a brittle, confused sound that shattered the quiet. "This is a joke," he stated, looking from the lawyer to his sister. A final, twisted joke from the old man. "Right?" But Abernathy didn't look up from the document. His face remained a granite slab of professional duty. The words hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. The smirk was gone from Marcus's face, replaced by a dawning horror. Abernathy continued, his voice steady. "To my daughter Alina," he read, turning his impassive gaze to her. "To the woman who inherited her mother's beauty, but none of her kindness, who measured love in carats and square footage, I leave you my late wife's portrait. It is my final hope that in seeing her face each day, you might one day be reminded of the compassion you have long forgotten." He paused. No equity, no properties, no authority. Alina went pale, the vibrant color draining from her face, leaving her makeup looking like a painted mask on a statue. "This isn't legal," she whispered, her voice barely audible. The angry clicks of her heels were forgotten. She seemed frozen to the spot, a creature of fire suddenly encased in ice. The portrait of her mother, a woman she barely remembered, was a profound insult, a reminder of everything she wasn't. It was worthless. The attorney, unmoved by the brewing storm, simply turned the page. The crinkle of the paper was the loudest sound in the room. "The remainder of my estate," he announced, "including all companies, properties, stocks, bonds, and liquid assets, is to be bequeathed in its entirety to a single beneficiary." Both siblings leaned forward, their shock momentarily eclipsed by a desperate, grasping curiosity. Who, if not them, then who? The question hung between them, a silent, frantic scream. "Who?" Marcus demanded, his voice cracking with a mix of rage and disbelief. The grand library, once a symbol of their impending wealth, suddenly felt small and claustrophobic, the walls closing in. Abernathy took a deep breath before delivering the final blow. Naomi Brooks. The name dropped into the room like a stone, and the silence that followed was absolute, a vacuum where all sound and reason had ceased to exist. Then, chaos erupted. Naomi Brooks. Alina screamed, the name tasting like poison in her mouth. The waitress, the one from the diner. The absurdity of it was too much. This had to be a hallucination. My father was losing his mind. Marcus roared, jumping to his feet. "This is coercion, undue influence. We'll sue." We'll drag this through every court in the country." Accusations flew, threats were screamed, and the library became a theater of impotent fury. But none of it mattered. As Abernathy calmly explained, the will was airtight. It had been drafted, reviewed, and witnessed with impeccable precision. Henry Calloway had been of sound mind and firm resolve. He had planned his final verdict with meticulous care. Miles away, across the city, in a small, brightly lit diner that smelled of coffee and fried onions, Naomi Brooks wiped down a sticky countertop. She was humming softly to a song on the radio, her mind on her dwindling tips and the long bus ride home. She was completely, blissfully unaware that her life had just been split in two. The life she knew, and the life that was about to crash into her. The storm that had broken in the Calloway Library was moving, gathering speed and power, and it was heading straight for her. Naomi was about to learn the truth about a quiet, kind old man who always ordered the black coffee and a slice of apple pie. The diner was quieter than usual that night. It was the kind of quiet that makes the little hairs on your arm stand up, the kind that feels like the world is holding its breath. Naomi was just wiping down the counter, her movements slow and automatic. Her mind wasn't really there. It was drifting through a grocery list, her daughter's homework, the mundane rhythm of tomorrow. Then, the bell over the door chimed, cutting through the silence. A man in a perfectly tailored suit stepped inside. He looked like he'd taken a wrong turn on his way to a boardroom, completely out of place among the cracked vinyl and smell of stale coffee. He walked straight to the counter and asked for her by name. "Naomi," he said, and her heart didn't just drop, it plummeted. Outside, a sleek black car was idling at the curb, its engine a low, ominous hum. Her first thought was disaster. Someone was hurt, her daughter, her mom. A terrible mistake had been made, and this man was the messenger. Her hands felt clammy as she led him to a booth in the corner, the one with the torn seat. He sat opposite her, his posture ramrod straight, and spoke with a chilling precision. "My name is Arthur Vance," he said. "I'm here to talk to you about Henry Calloway." The name hit her like a splash of ice water. Henry, sweet, quiet old Henry who used to come in for coffee and a slice of pie every Tuesday. The man continued, explaining things that didn't make sense: a test, a will, an inheritance. Naomi let out a single, sharp laugh, a sound that was more disbelief than humor. She shook her head, her ponytail swinging. "This is wrong," she whispered. "There's been a mistake. You have the wrong Naomi." But it wasn't a mistake. Arthur laid out the documents on the sticky tabletop, legal papers filled with clauses and numbers that made her head spin. Her hands started to tremble, but not with excitement. It was fear, a deep, cold dread that settled in her bones. "I don't want this," she said, her voice barely audible. "I can't." The man Arthur just nodded, his expression unreadable. "Henry knew you would say that," he replied calmly. "He said that's precisely why it had to be you." When she finally stepped back outside, the city lights seemed too bright, the sounds too loud. The world she had known just an hour ago felt flimsy, like a movie set. Back in her tiny apartment, she found her daughter sleeping soundly, a picture of innocence. Naomi knelt by the bed, held her daughter's small hand, and finally let the tears fall. They weren't tears of joy. They were tears of weight, the crushing pressure of a future she had never asked for. Power had found her, dragged her out of the shadows, whether she wanted it or not. The world was watching now, and Naomi, the waitress from the quiet diner, would have to decide who she was going to become with everything, quite literally, in her hands. The choice wasn't just about money, it was about her soul. Her old life felt like a photograph now, faded and distant. Days turned into a blur of meetings with lawyers, financial advisors, and stern-faced board members. They all looked at her with a mixture of curiosity and skepticism. This woman, in her worn-out jeans, who still smelled faintly of coffee and bleach, was now in charge of a global empire. She tried to understand the ledgers, the stock portfolios, the intricate web of companies that all traced back to Henry. It was like trying to learn a foreign language overnight. Some nights, she'd just sit in the lavish penthouse they'd put her in, staring out at the city skyline, feeling like an imposter in a dead man's life. The luxury was suffocating. She missed the simple exhaustion after a long shift, the easy banter with her regulars, the comforting predictability of her old routine. One evening, Arthur found her in the vast, empty library of the penthouse, surrounded by books she had no interest in reading. "You're fighting it," he said, not as a question, but as a statement. Naomi didn't look up. "I don't belong here." This was his world, not mine. Arthur sighed, a surprisingly human sound from the man who seemed more machine than person. "Henry didn't choose you to continue his world, Naomi. He chose you to change it." He told her more about Henry then, not the billionaire mogul, but the man. A man who had grown isolated and disillusioned by the very wealth and power he had built. He saw a system that was broken, that preyed on the small and the voiceless. He saw in Naomi, in her kindness and her quiet strength, a chance for something different. He hadn't left her a fortune. He had left her a responsibility. That conversation was a turning point. The fear didn't vanish, but something else started to grow alongside it. A spark of purpose. She started asking questions. Not about profit margins, but about people. She visited the factories, the charities, the communities her new empire touched. She saw the faces of the people whose lives were shaped by the decisions made in those sterile boardrooms. She saw families like her own, just trying to get by. The weight on her shoulders didn't lessen, but it changed shape. It was no longer just a burden, it was a tool. The power that had terrified her was now something she could wield. She could protect, she could build, she could fix. It wasn't an easy transformation. She faced resistance at every turn. The old guard, the men in their tailored suits, fought her. They called her naive, reckless, emotional. They tried to manipulate her, to bury her in legal jargon and corporate procedure, but they underestimated her. They saw a waitress, but they didn't see the woman who had single-handedly raised a daughter, who had juggled bills, and scraped by with a resilience they couldn't possibly comprehend. She learned to use their language against them, to turn their own rules to her advantage. Her daughter was her anchor, her North Star. Every decision she made, she asked herself if it would create a world she would be proud for her daughter to inherit. The story of Naomi is not a fairy tale. It's a story about what happens when ordinary people are given extraordinary power. It's a reminder that true strength isn't about the money in your bank account or the title on your door. It's about your character, your integrity, and the choices you make when no one is watching. Naomi didn't want the power, but she learned to carry it. She didn't become a different person. She became more of who she already was, a protector, a fighter, a mother. The world had handed her an empire, and in return, she was determined to give it a conscience. Naomi Brooks didn't feel powerful. She felt small. The lawyer finished, explaining, his words echoing in the sterile office. Holdings, boards, assets, futures. They sounded unreal, like they belonged to another life. Not hers. Her daughter Maya squeezed her hand. "Mama, are you okay?" Naomi managed to nod, even though a storm of confusion was raging inside her. She had only one question, the only one that truly mattered. "Why me?" The lawyer, a man who had seen it all, looked at her with a soft gaze. "Because you gave without knowing who he was," he said. "Because you lost something precious to protect a complete stranger. Because you treated him like a human being." That stranger was Henry Calloway, a billionaire who had disguised himself as a homeless man for a day. Naomi, a diner cook, barely scraping by, had shared her meal with him and given him her last $5 for a bus ticket, even after her own wallet was stolen. She did it without a second thought. Now Henry Calloway was gone, and he had left his entire empire to her. That night, Naomi couldn't sleep. She sat at her small kitchen table, the same table where unpaid bills used to pile up, mocking her. Nothing in the room looked different, but everything had changed. By morning, her quiet street was a circus. Reporters filled the lawn, their cameras flashing like angry lightning. Voices shouted, hurling accusations. They called her greedy, they called her a liar, they called her a thief, an opportunist who had tricked a vulnerable old man. Naomi didn't speak. She didn't engage with the chaos. She just did what she always did. She took Maya to school, shielding her from the prying lenses and cruel words, her face a mask of calm she didn't feel. Back in the gleaming towers of Calloway Enterprises, panic was spreading. The executives, the men in sharp suits who had served Henry for decades, expected extravagance. They braced for inexperience, for chaos, for a woman who would surely run the company into the ground. They prepared to wrestle control from her. But Naomi didn't give them the fight they were expecting. In her first board meeting, she didn't talk about quarterly projections or market shares. Instead, she listened. She sat there, in her simple, clean dress, and just listened to them talk. Then, she started asking questions. Simple questions. Who works the longest hours in our company? Who struggles the most to make ends meet? Who are the people whose voices are never heard? The room fell silent. These were questions they had never considered. Questions that didn't appear on any balance sheet. The executives, accustomed to a world of numbers and profits, didn't know how to answer. They looked at each other, perplexed. This wasn't the kind of leadership they knew. Naomi didn't rush. She didn't go on a wild spending spree or redecorate the executive suite. Her first actions were quiet, almost invisible to the outside world. She protected jobs that were on the chopping block. She used the vast resources now at her disposal to quietly pay off the company's debts, stabilizing its foundation. She made sure the diner, where she used to work, the place where it all began, stayed open, ensuring her former colleagues kept their jobs. Meanwhile, the vultures were circling. Henry Calloway's estranged children, Marcus and Elena, filed a barrage of lawsuits. They claimed their father was not of sound mind. They painted Naomi as a master manipulator. But every single lawsuit failed. Henry Calloway, a brilliant and meticulous man, had planned for everything. His will was ironclad. His intentions made crystal clear through a series of letters and video testimonies, all detailing his encounter with Naomi and why he chose her. He knew his children would fight, and he had built an unbreachable fortress around his final wish. Weeks turned into months. The media frenzy faded as the sensational story grew old. The noise died down. And then, something strange, something wonderful, began to happen. The empire started to heal. Under Naomi's quiet guidance, a fundamental shift occurred. Workers were no longer just numbers on a payroll. They were treated like people. Their concerns were heard. Their hard work was rewarded. Company-owned buildings in neglected neighborhoods were renovated and turned into affordable homes. Profit, the sole obsession for so long, started to follow purpose. The company didn't just make more money. It started to make a difference. Through it all, Naomi never changed. She still lived in her modest house. She still cooked soup for her neighbors every Tuesday. She still found herself instinctively counting change out of habit when she bought groceries. The immense power she now wielded never changed who she was. It only revealed it. It magnified the kindness and integrity that were there all along. Henry Calloway built his wealth with money, stone by stone, deal by deal. Naomi Brooks rebuilt it with something far more valuable: humanity. The lesson here is so simple, yet we so often forget it. Kindness, given freely and without expectation, never truly disappears. It ripples out into the world and often returns in ways that no one, not the giver or the receiver, can ever predict. So let me ask you, if you were Naomi, faced with that monumental inheritance, what would you have done? And more importantly, think about that first moment. If you were her, tired, with your own struggles, would you have given away those last $5?